I want to start at the end of February this year, at the beginning of this war. Pakistan bombed Kabul, and within days its own defense minister was using the words open war. Afghan forces were attacking Pakistani positions along the frontier, but it did not say small. On the 16th of March, a Pakistani airstrike hit a drug rehabilitation hospital in Kabul. The UN mission counted at least 269 civilians killed, the deadliest single attack on civilians in Afghanistan since the Taliban returned to power. By the end of March, the UN had counted 372 Afghan civilians dead in 3 months, almost two-thirds of them killed from the air. Ceasefires have come and gone. China convened talks. They ended without an agreement. But I want to begin where it began, because the question I care about is not who fired first in February, it is why there is a line here at all. It was agreed in 1893 in a document that is barely a page of text, 7 short articles and a map. And I want to show you that page, because once you have seen how thin it is, you cannot unsee it in anything that has happened since. It runs about 2,600 kilometers, roughly 1,600 miles, through some of the highest and most difficult terrain in the region, and did not arrive at a frontier between two peoples. It was drawn across traditional tribal territories, Pashtun and Baloch, and bisected them. This is the phrase the reference literature actually uses, bisected. The line cut through the middle of existing communities and declared a frontier where there had not been one. And the simple version of what followed, Britain drew a line, Afghanistan rejected it forever, is wrong. Afghan rulers signed agreements reaffirming this frontier with Britain more than once. And I'll come to those because they turn out to be the most interesting thing in the story. What is true and has always held for every Afghan government since 1947 is narrower and much harder to argue with. Afghanistan has never accepted the Durand Line as the permanent international border with Pakistan. That position has survived kings, Mujahideen, Republicans, and the Taliban. On this and on almost nothing else, they have agreed. Now, to understand why anyone drew it, you have to understand what Britain was frightened of. For most of the 19th century, the empire had one recurring nightmare: a Russian army coming through Central Asia into India. And it was not imaginary. In 1885, at a place called Panjshir, Russian forces took ground the Afghans claimed, and Britain and Russia came close to a war over it. That is the temperature this line was drawn in. Two empires edging toward each other, with an unmapped country in between. Now, before that, Britain had already tried the direct approach twice. The first time in 1839 went well for about 2 years, and then Kabul rose. In January 1842, the British garrison and the people traveling with it, around 16,000, of whom roughly 4,500 were troops, and the rest camp followers and civilians, left the city to march 90 miles to Jalalabad in the snow. One European reached Jalalabad alive on the 13th of January. Others survived as prisoners and were released later. The rest died in the passes. Britain went back in 1878 and got what it wanted. And it is worth being precise about how little that was worth. It achieved its immediate objectives. It also lost an envoy, Cavagnari, murdered in Kabul in 1879, and spent years fighting in the mountains, and came away having learned that Afghanistan was not going to be governed cheaply by anyone. So the conclusion was not to take it. It was to make it into a buffer, a padded space between one empire and another, not a colony, a cushion. And a cushion needs an edge. So who drew the edge? Mortimer Durand was Foreign Secretary to the Government of India. He was not a soldier, not the surveyor who would later walk the ground, an administrator. And in the autumn of 1893, the Viceroy, Lord Lansdowne, sent him to Kabul to negotiate with the Emir of Afghanistan. And the interesting bit here that the simple version usually leaves out is Durand was not sent to negotiate a modern international border between the two sovereign states. He was sent to settle the limits of British and Afghan spheres of influence. That is a different job. A border says this is where one nation ends and another begins. A sphere of influence says this is where my government exercises influence and yours stops. And the agreement's own language gives it away. It talks about spheres, about influence, about where each government would and would not interfere. It is the vocabulary of a filing system. In fairness, the agreement does also provide for a frontier to be laid down in detail and demarcated later. So this was not purely abstract. But the thing being fixed in that room, that autumn, was the reach of two administrations. And it was made between two governments. The communities whose territory it crossed were not parties to it. Now, this is not an accusation, it is just what the document is. Nobody sends a foreign secretary from Shimla to ask a valley whether it would like to be divided. It was not that kind of errand. Now, there is a second person in the story, and the most retellings skip him. Abdur Rahman Khan spent roughly 11 years in exile in Russian Central Asia before taking the Afghan throne in 1880. He is remembered as the Iron Amir, and he earned it. He broke revolt after revolt and built a far more centralized Afghan state than had existed before, by force. He was not a man who signed things by accident. This is exactly what makes this hard. Because he did sign, and the agreement itself tells you what he got. His British subsidy was raised from 12 lakhs of rupees a year to 18. Britain undertook not to obstruct his purchases and import of munitions, and each side committed to non-interference in the other's sphere. Now the last one matters. What he was buying was a clearer British commitment to stay out of the Afghan side of the line. So was it signed under duress? The Afghan case is that a ruler dependent on British money, with British India on one side and an expanding Russia on the other, was not in a position to say no. The British case is simply that he signed and was paid and knew what he was doing. Both of those can be true at once, and that is usually what a hard treaty looks like from the inside. The agreement was signed on the 12th of November 1893. 7 articles, a map, barely a page. Then came the part that actually built the border. From 1894 to 96, joint commissions walked the ground and turned that page into pillars and cairns and marks on rock, which is how an abstraction becomes a fact. Someone writes a sentence in a room in Kabul, and 2 years later a man on mountainside is stacking stones to make it true. And once the stones are there, the sentence stops being an opinion. Those commissions did not have an easy time. They were working through country where the people who lived there had not been consulted, and in places they resisted the survey outright, violently. There is a moment in the British parliamentary record where it is put plainly: the consent of the tribes was apparently not sought before troops entered their territory to mark the boundary. Now this is the detail that outlives everything else in this story. The line was agreed by two governments and marked across the territory of communities who were not parties to the agreement. They are still not parties to it. In 2026, they are the ones being shelled. Like I said before, Afghanistan did not spend a century refusing this frontier. Afghanistan repeatedly reaffirmed it. In 1905, the Afghan government reaffirmed the 1893 agreement. In 1919, at the end of the Third War with Britain, the frontier was accepted again. And in 1921, it was reaffirmed once more. So for nearly 30 years, Kabul and London repeatedly reaffirmed the frontier. And then the party on the other side of the agreement ceased to exist. In August 1947, British India ended and Pakistan was created. And it inherited the frontier because that is what successor states do. Afghanistan's response is the detail that I cannot believe is not better known. When Pakistan applied to join the United Nations, one country voted against it. Afghanistan, the only no vote on earth. And then, a month later, the Afghan delegate said he no longer maintained that opposition because he expected the dispute to be settled diplomatically. 2 years later, Kabul stopped hedging. In 1949, a lawyer Jirga declared the agreements Afghanistan had made with Britain, the Durand Agreement, included null and void. Pakistan rejected that declaration outright and has ever since. You cannot, in Pakistan's view, dissolve a treaty by announcing that you have dissolved it, and that is the actual shape of this dispute. Not a line rejected from the moment it was drawn, a line agreed, reaffirmed 3 times, and repudiated the moment it stopped being a frontier with an empire and became a frontier with a neighbor. So what happened to the land the line ran through? Britain did not govern it the way it governed the settled districts of British India. It did something stranger. The frontier belt was administered indirectly through political agents, tribal intermediaries, subsidies, and punitive expeditions, with collective punishment as a routine instrument, under a separate legal code. Broad internal autonomy under British supervision. Pakistan inherited that arrangement in 1947 and kept it, a separate constitutional and legal regime, the frontier crimes regulation among it, until 2018 when the tribal areas were merged into Khyber Pakhtunkhwa. 71 years, formerly part of Pakistan, governed under a different set of rules, and a belt like that across a frontier one side does not accept as permanent turns out to be extraordinarily useful. In the 1980s, during the Soviet war in Afghanistan, it became a major conduit. Weapons, money, and fighters moving toward the war through networks backed by Pakistan, the United States, and Saudi Arabia. The war ended, the networks, the institutions, and the cross-border relationships did not simply disappear. Which brings us to why two governments are shelling each other in 2026. Pakistan says militant attacks it from Afghan soil, principally the Pakistani Taliban, the TTP, who are a separate organization from the Afghan Taliban, now governing Kabul. However much the names invite you to merge them, Afghanistan says it does not control them and will not police a border it has never accepted as permanent. Both of those statements can be true at the same time. They are both descriptions of the same gap, and the gap is the shape of the line. Now, if you go looking for why Afghanistan rejects the line, you will find over and over one specific claim, that the 1893 agreement was a lease, a 100-year lease, expiring in 1993. You will find it in comment sections, in newspapers, and in speeches by people who should know better. It is not true. Read the agreement. It is barely a page. You can read the whole thing in 3 minutes. There is no term, no expiry, no lease. And in 1905, the Afghan government reaffirmed it. But debunking the myth is not the same as dismissing the grievance. But the central Afghan objection was not simply that the paper ran out. It is that the settlement was made under pressure by one ruler across the territory of communities who were not parties to it. And that when British India disappeared, Afghanistan was told it now applied permanently to a state that had not existed when it was signed. Now that objection survives the myth completely. That myth just keeps getting told instead because it is shorter. But then in our lifetime, something happened that nobody in 1893 imagined. Pakistan started building it. Since March 2017, Pakistan has been fencing the Durand Line, via ditches, forts, watchtowers across terrain that spent 130 years being unfenceable. Pakistan says it is nearly done. In 2023, it put the fencing at 98% complete. In 2024, the figure being quoted was over 90. Those numbers move around, partly because fencing and fortifications get counted separately, and partly because sections of it keep coming down. Afghanistan has objected at every stage. And you can see why. For Kabul, letting the fence become permanent risks turning a disputed line into a physical fact. Think about what that means. A sentence written in a room in Kabul in 1893 has been slowly turning into steel ever since. Not because anyone re-argued the case, because it was there. And things that are there get built on. So why does nobody just fix it? Because of the trap underneath. Pakistan cannot simply give the line up, because it regards itself as the successor to British India's frontier, and succession is the rule that holds most of the modern maps together. Pull that thread here and the logic runs everywhere, through Africa, through the Middle East, along every border a European drew and left behind. And Afghanistan cannot accept it, because recognizing the line as permanent would mean formally accepting the separation of territory and communities it has claimed for a century. And no government in Kabul has been willing to be the one that does that. Neither of these positions is irrational. This is exactly what makes it permanent. Two coherent positions pointed at each other across a line that neither of them drew. In 1893, an administrator was sent to settle a question about spheres of influence, and he settled it barely a page. The people living along the line were not parties to the agreement. It was not that kind of errand. 130 years later, that page is still deciding who gets shot at. Nobody has ever found a way to unmake a line. That is the whole problem with drawing one.